Welcome to Commander Central, episode 308, and today we'll be taking a look beneath the surface of cards that just reading them aren't necessarily easy to understand why they're good. I'm Dana.
I'm Max.
And I'm Chris.
Gentlemen, how is it going today? Everyone survive the big snowstorm this week?
Yeah, I even went to work. Where were you guys?
It wasn't that terrible.
That is exactly what I did.
I just didn't want to deal with the road, so I stayed in.
It wasn't even that bad, actually.
No, it was kind of a weak sauce snow day. Like, my wife and son were happy to not be going to school, but it was not that crazy.
Yeah, I think the worst that I had was on the drive to work. I had a guy blow by me 10 miles an hour faster than I was driving. I was already going 5 over the speed limit and created like one of those whiteout storms in front of him.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And then I couldn't see anything, so I'm like, well, I'm just going to hold the steering wheel straight because I'm going down a straight road, and if we hit something, I guess.
Like, right at that point, you're like, well, it's out of my hands. Yeah, I've been there.
Carrie Underwood, Jesus takes the wheel type of thing is where I was at right there.
Yeah, I just wasn't in the mood to get out, and I didn't want to shovel my driveway out until it was all done, too. That was part of it. I'm like, I don't want to have to do it twice. I'll just wait till everything is done, and then I'll deal with taking care of all the snow removal. But Max had a new deck that he could have tried out, but put the stoppers on for one more week.
Yep.
What'd you wind up putting together?
Ishin, the double attack trigger commander from Kamigawa.
Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Yes.
You had most of your cards at home, you said, but you had to grab a few from the shop?
I grabbed a few from the shop and had to order a few from TCG Player, but found some substitutes until those show up next week.
Nice. We'll have to make sure I go, for sure I'll go this week and play so we can get some reps in.
Yeah.
Good deal.
Yeah.
It's been, everyone's been dealing with we have brand new cards from Kamigawa out. People are like updating decks, doing that kind of thing. So that's been keeping me busy on the Magic front for the most part. Well, I guess we got the Street Fighter Secret Lair stuff got announced and came out, and that's handful of all new cards that are Street Fighter themed. Is that a thing that either of you are interested in?
No,
Me.
What?
That's your jam, Max?
Yes, I plan on getting the Street Fighter one and the one that comes with Hall of the Bandit Lord, so I think that's the Neon Dynasty Inc.
Yes,
set.
yep.
Yeah, those are the two I'll be getting.
Did you just a Street Fighter fan, or is there a particular card you wanted for a deck or something?
Both. Like, I remember playing like Street Fighter 2 on my Super Nintendo as a kid.
Yeah.
And then there's a couple cards in here that I'm interested in building. Specifically, I want to build Blanca, who is the Gruul commander, and I'm going to try to do like a Spell Slinger Voltron-y type deck.
They really did a nice job with in things like color identity, making Guile the red, white, and blue character, and, Chun-Li having multi-kicker, and Reach on, is it Taoism? I forget what character it is. Like, stuff like that is really clever. They clearly put a lot of thought into design, which I like. I played Street Fighter. I'm not like, I don't have a lot of nostalgia for it necessarily, but it was fun. But I do appreciate them going the extra mile for stuff like that. So
I just want the little baby planeswalkers. That's all I want.
Those were pretty cool, too.
I need the Angrath really bad.
We say it every time with the Secret Lair stuff. It's easy to avoid if it's not your jam, and if it is, it's a cool, fun thing that you get baby planeswalkers or, the neon art of Hall of the Bandit Lord like Max wants. It's something that you can ignore if you want to ignore it, and there's fun stuff there if you want to participate, and hopefully, at the very least, it keeps prices in check of the existing cards, if not, drives a few things down. So it's a win all around.
Yeah, I know a guy, he buys a lot of them, and he actually brought in some of them the other day, and they were stickers, I think is what he was explaining to him. And he's like, I'm not going to pull the sticker off. And I'm like, why? I'm like, let me rip one off. I want to see what's underneath of it.
Yeah, wasn't it a land or something, a basic plane, or there was something with... Yeah, I remember those. I didn't pick up any of those ones, but...
I don't know what it was, because he got that, and then he got, like, the Swords to Plowshares and the Blood Moons and stuff like that, and the swords were beautiful. I'm like, what do you want for one of those? He's like, no, those are going to my legacy decks. I'm like, oh, come on!
Oh, yeah, gotta bling out those old school decks, for sure.
Oh, yeah.
So, if you out there in listener land want to reach out to us and tell us about your thoughts on Street Fighter or anything at all, how would you go about doing that, Chris?
Well, you can reach us on a multitude of social media platforms. You can find us on Twitter at CMDR Central. You can search us up on Facebook, CMDR Central. You can find us on YouTube by searching CMDR Central. And you can also find us online at CMDRCentral.com.
You can also head over to patreon.com/CMDR Central. Check out our reward tiers such as a Decks You Play show, or just joining our community to chat and play virtual EDH with everybody. And this week we want to say hello and thank you to two new patrons, Kat Wendell and Michael Brangwine.
Thank you, Kat and Michael, and thank you everyone who supports the show, whether it's through supporting us through Patreon or supporting us just by listening and clicking like and upvoting the show on whatever medium you use to listen. It means a lot. So thanks to everyone out there. We do appreciate it.
Yes, thank you very much.
Before we jump into the main show topic here, I think, Chris, there's something you wanted to say.
Yes, I wanted to inform all the listeners, going forward, there might be some episodes where I will not be on. I want to let you all know that I am dealing with some medical issues. I have what is known as stage 5 kidney disease, so I'm in chronic kidney failure. So I go in on March 1st to have surgery done to put it's called perineal dialysis. It is going to be a pump that's going to be surgically implanted into my stomach so I can do dialysis at home. So this next week I won't be on. I'm going to try to be on the week after, but going forward it'll be, hit and miss depending on how my medical stuff's going. So I just want everyone to know that I'm still around and everything. But this is what's going on in my life. So if you have any questions or anything, feel free to reach out to me, via Slack, via Facebook Messenger if you want to, Twitter or whatever. I have no problem talking about it. So just wanted to make sure everyone knew, just so no one's worried, oh no, he died or something like that. I actually had a friend of mine who is one of the Patreon supporters and listener and all that, and there was a couple times where I wasn't on, and he'd get a hold of me. He's like, "Are you okay?" I'm like, "Oh no, I'm fine. Just taking, we got day off here, and someone else is taking a day off for that one." And they're like, "Okay." So I want to make sure that everyone's aware of it, just so there's no confusion going on, further down the road.
Well, we wish you the best, man, and Max and I'll be here for you for anything you need, and we'll cover if there's weeks you can't make it, we got you. So
yes. Thank you very much, guys.
No problem.
All right, so the show topic here, what we're going to talk about are cards that are a little bit difficult to understand, and I don't mean things like the Abyss or Chains of Mephistopheles from back in Legends that have a gazillion things in their text box that are worded very badly. I mean cards whose strength maybe isn't apparent when you read them, and the example I'm going to use, even though it's not really a commander card, is the card Gush that I think was from back in Mercadian Masks.
Super powerful card.
Yeah, and I didn't understand. I remember seeing it on the ban list when I first came back to Magic, 10-ish years ago, for Legacy, and I was like, why is that card banned? It's 4 and a blue. Yeah, it's an instant, but it's a 4 and a blue to draw 2 cards, and it says you may return 2 islands you control to their owner's hands rather than pay Gush's mana cost. And I'm like, well, that sounds like a miserable alternative casting cost too. How often am I going to want to bounce 2 islands just to draw 2 cards? That seems terrible. And it's maybe not great in Commander, but that's not where it's a problem. It's a problem in Legacy where, first of all, decks don't run a ton of lands, so it's not a huge deal to miss your land drop anyway. There's a ton of mana rocks, things like Moxen that show up in that format, so you don't necessarily need to make sure you hit your land drop every turn. And because of that, you can bounce 2 islands to your hand. You were going to maybe miss a land drop anyway next turn because you just don't have that many lands in your deck. Make your land drop with one of the ones you bounced anyway and get 2 additional free cards for it for kind of almost only bouncing 1 land. You can do it in your main phase after you've already missed a land drop, bounce lands that are already tapped and be able to play one, then untap for your land for turn and get kind of a free mana essentially out of it. In that format, it's a crazy strong card to the point where a former pro Magic player, Stephen Menenidin, I believe his name is pronounced, literally wrote a book about Gush called Understanding Gush. There's an actual book you can buy in hardcover about how to play Gush and why it's so powerful in Legacy.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. It's very similar to Daze, where, you bounce an island to counter a spell, so. And
again, Daze in Commander doesn't look that good, but when you understand the context of it, where it's played and why it's powerful, then it kind of becomes apparent. It's actually on the most recent EDH Recast stream, we were talking about Grizzlebrand. And not that Grizzlebrand doesn't look good, because it does look good, but there's a ton of broken cards in Commander. But Grizzlebrand is one of those cards you don't realize how broken Grizzlebrand is until you watch someone play it in Modern.
It is very disgusting.
You see it and you're like, oh, that's a really good card. There's a lot of good stuff in Commander. And then you see someone in Modern, you're like, oh no, that card's horrifying. You just have to kind of see it to really grok it. So that's what we want to talk about here is cards that maybe aren't readily apparent on the surface why they're good. So we'll kind of break them down and explain. And the first one I'm going to hand to Chris here because he's our resident Modern player and probably understands better than Max or I why Faithless Looting is so good. Because it's a card that, again, on its surface, when you look at it, you're like, wow, I did not want to why do I want to discard stuff? And I feel like there's better ways to draw cards nowadays in red. Faithless Looting is still a crazy powerful card, and it becomes much more apparent why that's true when you play Modern, right, Chris?
Yeah, well, so we'll even go further than that. Faithless Looting is banned in Modern.
Right,
so,
yeah, right.
I mean, that just shows just how powerful the card actually is, And people look at this card and they're like, okay, I have to discard 2 cards. That's immediately what people see with a card like this, is I have to discard. And that is actually a huge upside in my opinion. And I don't know why a lot of people get so shy about that. They want, I don't know if it's a greed aspect or maybe it's more of like a what if, like you're trying to cover all your bases type of thing. Like I don't want to discard these cards because, maybe down the line I could need these, etc., etc. One of my teammates on our traveling team, we actually had a long talk about discarding, and this came up off of a Dragon Rage Channeler, because Dragon Rage Channeler allows you to look at the top card of your library whenever you cast a non-creature spell, and then you can pitch that card into the graveyard. And he always told me, he said, you think about it in the aspect of where you are in the game. Do I need this card right now? If I do not need this card, I discard it. Because the goal of the game is to dig down to your win cons of the game. Faithless Looting for 1 mana allows you to dig 2 cards. It is probably one of the most efficient card draw spells that is legal to play. I mean, there are other ones such as, Brainstorm, Ponder, Serum Visions, Preordain. All those cards let you see 3 cards overall, but they all have, downsides as well. This one, just straight up, you're netting 2 cards for the discard of 2 cards. But you get to flash this spell back as well, so you're getting double duty off of this card. In my opinion, it is probably the best card draw spell in red. I don't know, what do you guys think about that?
I think for myself personally, I will say I, number one, tend to not play a lot of recursion. I don't know why that is. My Glissa deck, I guess, does recur stuff from the graveyard, but for the most part, I don't recur stuff from my graveyard. I kind of smash straight ahead versus worry about, once I've used something, I've used it up and I'm done. So putting stuff in my graveyard for the most part isn't something I very often recycle or bring back. So the pitching aspect of it doesn't really help me. I also tend to not play combo or anything, so I'm not looking for specific cards. I just want cards.
Yes.
So for that reason, for me personally, I tend to want to just draw versus filter or loot. Yep. But having watched real deal pro Magic players play, or even, CEDH players, or even combo players, that's when it drove home for me how good Faithless Looting was. And I mentioned Modern back when it was legal, Chris. Watching you practice reps and grind reps for before you would play in a Modern tournament, you played a lot of red, so I saw you cast a lot of Faithless Looting, so I just watching you test out decks and do play testing. That's when it drove home to me if you are somebody who is reusing your graveyard, which red does a good bit of, particularly in that format at the time, that's when I realized, I get it. I didn't quite get it before, and that's what drove it home. And same thing in Commander, like you said. If my particular play style, in 3 or 4 different ways, it doesn't work for me, but that's not true of most people. I think people tend to use their graveyards a lot. I think, combo's pretty popular. I think for most folks, that kind of card is way better than maybe they even realize, even though I think nowadays it's pretty popular. But I think for newer players, it's kind of a tough thing to wrap your brain around, understanding why it's so good, and it's a fantastic card. Do you run it in anything, Max, at all?
I don't run it in anything, but I probably will slot it into Ishin and Ubash, because I'm already running the other red card draw that, you discard then draw, or discard 2 cards to draw 3. Sure. And I think this is where Faithless Looting just is better than all of those, because you get to draw first. You're not not taking that risk of, okay, if I pitch this 2-drop that I might use to get something better, this is, okay, I'm going to draw 2 cards. Cool, I don't need 4 lands in my hand. I can discard one of these lands I just drew and keep that other card I just drew.
Yeah, the big thing I see about with Faithless Looting is the mana efficiency of it for 1 mana to do this versus, I actually had a talk with a fellow player who's playing a Naya deck when I looked through his deck, I was like, okay, you're kind of lacking in card draw. And he's like, well, suggest some card draw to me. And I immediately said Faithless Looting, and he just shied away. He's like, no. He's like, I don't want to discard cards. Why don't we play the green card draw? And I actually made a pro-con list over this, between green and Faithless Looting. And while green, you get more cards, you get to see more cards per card that you cast, such as Rishkar's Expertise, stuff like that, usually netting 4 or 5 cards. You don't discard unless you're playing Greater Good or something like that. But the cons of this is that this requires creatures. Whether it's, right, ETBs off of the Great Henge or the Garrick's Uprising, or you need a big creature to draw lots of cards. That's like a huge downside. Not to mention all the good green card draw spells are high CMC cost. I think the cheapest one is 4. I could be wrong on that. Because I think Harmonize is 4. I think Hunter's Prowess is 4. I think majority of them are all around the 4 CMC mark. So that's a lot of mana investment to do that. While yes, you are ramping in green, wouldn't you rather be, casting something for 1 mana and then jamming out a 5-drop creature after that? That's my personal opinion on that over everything, but some people just want to play differently.
I'm going to talk about a card here in a minute called Experimental Synthesizer, which was just in the new Neon Dynasty set. But before I get to that, the reason I'm going to mention that is because Faithless Looting, you have to look at the whole card and what's all on there. So Faithless Looting costs a red, and it has flashback for 2 and a red. So if you think about it this way, that's 1 card that for basically 4 mana, so for 2 and 2 red total, assuming you use it and use both abilities, for 4 mana, you're going to get to draw 4 cards.
Yep.
And then discard 4 cards. So that's 4 new cards to hand. That's 4 attempts at whatever cares about discard, whether it's something like a madness trigger or whatever. You're going to get 2 spells that have been successfully cast. That's a lot of things you've just generated for 1 spell. Like it's created a whole bunch of game interactions. Now maybe you don't have, things that care about graveyard interaction. Maybe you don't have any madness spells, or you don't have any things that care about discarding or whatever. But there's a lot of decks that have multiple of those things. So Faithless Looting as a card can hit multiple beats in a single deck on 1 particular card to generate value in multiple different ways. And the reason I mentioned Experimental Synthesizer, so that's a artifact from Neon Dynasty, costs a single red, and it says when it enters the battlefield or leaves the battlefield, exile the top card of your library. Until end of turn, you may play that card. So when it comes into play or leaves, it generates a impulse draw trigger.
Yep.
It also says for 2 and a red, you can sacrifice it and create a 2/2 white samurai creature token with vigilance, activate that only as a sorcery. So again, you have, for the same cost of Faithless Looting, so not that I'm comparing the two, but for 2 red for total mana spent to use the full card, you get an artifact cast trigger casting it. You get an impulse draw. Then if you sacrifice it, you create a 2/2 white samurai token with vigilance. That's a creature ETBing. You have a creature. You generate a sacrifice trigger when you sacrifice it. Another impulse draw, and you generate an artifact going to your graveyard trigger.
Yep.
In an artifact deck, every single one of those things could be relevant on 1 single card. Now, I'm not saying every deck wants to run Synthesizer, but there's a lot of decks where that 1 single card is going to generate you value 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times. So just looking at the card doesn't necessarily make that apparent. But like once you really dig down and think about it, you're like, oh, in my Brea deck, that's going to generate.
Don't bring up Brea. No.
But like it's going to generate a trigger. When it comes into play, it's going to put a counter on whatever thing I have that cares about artifacts coming into play, and it's going to give me that impulse draw that's going to let me make my land drop for the turn, and then I can sacrifice to Brea if I need to. It's going to generate 1 more impulse draw trigger, and it's going to be in my graveyard when I want to do a trash to treasure thing or whatever. There's just a whole ton of things as 1 card in the right deck, a ton of value it can generate in a bunch of different ways that's not really readily apparent until you really look at the card and think about it.
Yes. I mean, there are a lot of cards like that. I've been looking, when we, you wanted to talk about this type of episode, I looked back on some cards too, and I'm like, this is actually a good card if you look at it, deeper than just at its face value.
So Max, you had a couple, like in a sequence here or series you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, I kind of want to talk about the cards from the Strixhaven Commander decks that all have the Demonstrate ability. So these are 5 sorceries, 1 in each color, and Demonstrate essentially says when you cast the spell, you may copy it, but if you do, choose an opponent, and they also get to copy it. I hadn't ran any of these until I got my Ubosh deck for Secret Santa, and the black one is in that deck. So that is Incarnation Technique, which is 4 and a black. You mill 5 cards, and then return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, and it has Demonstrate. So my Ubosh deck is a Reanimator type deck. As I've played this deck more, the Demonstrate can be tricky, because I would love to do this card twice, because it doesn't care about returning a card you just milled. A creature from those 5 you just milled. It's anything in your graveyard. But is it worth giving, which opponent should I copy? Give that copy to? Obviously I'm probably not going to give it to you, Dana, if you're playing Glissa.
Right.
And I'm probably not going to give it to Chris if he's playing Alesha. But I might give it to that mono green player that probably is only running, Reclaim in the seasons past, and I'm okay with that.
Or like, what if you're playing Anafenza the Foremost? This says, if a creature card will be put into an opponent's grave from anywhere, exile it.
Yeah.
So, like that, so then you're like, oh, I'm going to, for 5 mana, I'm going to be able to bring back, I'm going to mill 10 and bring back 2 creatures straight into play, and you're going to get nothing. And that's the best case. That's the perfect scenario with a perfect commander. But there's just situations, again, this is like, it's easy to look at it like a downside, but there's ways to, number one, mitigate that downside by giving it the trigger to a person who has nothing in their graveyard. So you're like, well, they could miss in their 5. And there's a decent chance they might. They're not necessarily going to get something amazing. Or it could be a situation where someone else is way ahead and you're like, I don't care what they get. We need to stop this person. So like whatever they get is going to be beneficial to me because it's not being aimed my way. It's being aimed that person who's got the big leads way. So who cares? There's just a lot of situations where Incarnation Technique and the Demonstrate ability on it isn't really a downside, even though it kind of looks like it might be.
Correct. I think the only Demonstrate cards that probably aren't great are the ones that, the white one that just destroys a non-land permanent and its controller creates 2 treasures, because I don't mind if something of mine gets destroyed, probably. Like, I think that's the one where your opponent's probably going to choose your big scary thing, where all the other ones are, shuffle your library and reveal cards until you reveal a non-land card and you can cast it.
Yep.
Blue makes a copy of something, and green returns something from your graveyard to your hand, and you gain life. I think the white one is the only one where it probably is going to bite you in the butt more often than not if you demonstrate it.
Yeah, that one definitely has a chance to come back and hose you. But even then, there's probably plenty of situations where like it's much more important to be able to remove 2 things, and even if the person who you give the copy to hits it back your direction, I mean, there's still situations where like even me losing my best thing is worth taking out the 2 best things.
Agreed.
Yeah.
I've seen that Incarnation go off where, all of a sudden, a Gisela hits the battlefield afterwards, and other, another big creature hits the battlefield, and you're just like, well, it doesn't even matter who they're targeting with this because we just can't win through this now. Right.
Well, kind of a similar card that I've had really good luck with so far is Baleful Mastery that was in Strixhaven. And it's 3 and a black for an instant and exile target creature or planeswalker. For 4 mana, isn't terrible. I mean, it wasn't that long ago Vraska's Contempt was a really, really solid card at the same CMC, basically.
Yep.
But the other text on here says you may pay 1 and a black rather than the spell's mana cost. And if 1 and a black was paid, an opponent draws a card. Not the opponent whose thing you exiled, just an opponent. So, number one, again, like the Demonstrate thing, that gives you the ability to say, okay, this person who's way ahead, I'm going to spend 1 and a black to remove their thing, and I will let you, player in last place, draw a card as long as you keep your guns aimed on that person and not me for a turn. You can make those kind of deals. Literally the last time I cast it in a game was when I was swinging on someone for lethal. And they're like, yeah, I have no blocks. That'll kill me. I said, before damage is dealt, I'm going to remove the creature from a third person in the game, killed their creature with Baleful Mastery, and let the person draw a card. And then they immediately died.
And then I would have drawn my fog, and I would have been like,
yeah,
fog.
Right. I guess. I mean, I took the chance there. But, I mean, I knew they weren't in green. I can't remember what the situation was, but it wasn't a worry. Again, that's a perfect kind of Anafenza situation where that's not going to happen every time or even most times. But, like, there's just a lot of situations where that card draw thing off Baleful Mastery is just not that big of a downside. I mean, it can absolutely bite you, and there's going to be times when someone will eventually top deck an answer with it, and you're going to be annoyed. But the amount of times that happens versus the amount of times being able to cast a way better go for the throat just offsets it. Like, occasionally you're going to get burned, but it's worth getting burned once in a while. If the other 25 times you use it, it works perfectly.
It's an exile, though. And I think
exactly.
Nowadays, people need to start playing more exile in their decks. Like, even if the card has a downside to it, I think the exile needs to be played like Anguish Unmaking and stuff like that. You cost you 3 life to exile something, but it is an exile effect.
Yeah. I mean, Go for the Throat is a great card for the same CMC, assuming you're casting Mastery for the 1 in black. And Go for the Throat doesn't hit artifact creatures, and it's not an exile, and it doesn't hit planeswalkers. So for the same cost, you're adding the ability to hit planeswalkers, you're adding an exile, so number one, you can deal with indestructible stuff. It's not recurable, you're not going to get death triggers. And number two, you can hit artifact creatures too, which is very relevant sometimes. It's just, I mean, as good as Go for the Throat is, Baleful Mastery is a better Go for the Throat. It's 95% of the time. And if you get burned once in a while, you get burned once in a while. That just is going to happen. Any other particular ones that you wanted to delve into a little bit here, Chris, and talk about?
Not entirely, like card base for sure. I do find this whole episode amusing because if we go back to our earliest episodes what was our biggest thing? You don't help your opponents.
Right, sure, for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
And this has just come full circle. And now we're starting to realize, that, maybe helping isn't so bad if the card is actually doing us better work than anything. And I know there's one that you have on your notes. It's actually one that we've talked about before, and that's Arcane Denial. So that's one we could discuss as well.
Yeah, Arcane Denial is 1 in a blue counter target spell, and at the beginning of next turn's upkeep, you draw a card, and the person whose spell you counter draws 2 cards.
Yep.
And that's a card, again, where probably 6 years ago or 7 years ago, looking at lists of counter spells, I wasn't probably considering Arcane Denial.
No.
It's like, I don't want to give people, why give people 2 cards when I can just run, counterspell or negate or whatever. Like, there's other alternatives I don't need to, or pay more for one of the 15 cancel variants or something and not have to give them anything. Why do it for just Arcane Denial? But as I've played a lot more Commander, I've come to realize it's not entirely a downside. Number one, you getting a card back to replace the counterspell is a big deal a lot of times.
Yes, and not to mention, if you're casting a counterspell, you're in a deck that wants to be drawing cards anyway.
Yeah.
So just replacing itself is huge amount of, upside tempo-based, strategy.
Exactly. The 1 in a blue is a big deal, particularly if you're playing in like a 3 or more color deck. But even in some greedy color-based decks where you're using a ton of blue, being able to only leave 1 blue mana up is a big deal. Versus one of the cancel variants or even regular counterspell where you have to leave up 2 blue. That can be a pretty big deal too. And, the draw 2 cards thing, again, it can be a situation where, you can use that to your advantage with somebody, or you can at least take the sting out of countering their spell. So like they aren't maybe as likely to come back at you because they got little something in return. It doesn't feel quite as bad. And we actually discussed Arcane Denial recently on an EDH Recast episode, and I mentioned how I've had situations before where I had a Swarm Intelligence or Double Vision out in my Kedison Crom deck that copy a spell that you cast, and someone's done something, tried to stop me from killing them or whatever it is, and I've cast a counter spell on their removal that gets copied because of whether it's Double Vision or Swarm Intelligence or whatever. So now I have a copy of a spell sitting there in a stack that does no good. I've Arcane Denial the copy before on more than one occasion.
That is so good.
Because it winds up being a 2 mana draw 3. Because I draw 2 for losing my spell and 1 for the Arcane Denial. So I've turned that into a draw effect before. And there's situations, I don't know if I've ever actually just cast a spell to cast one and then countered it with Arcane Denial. But like, if you were desperate enough, you could do that too. It's like, right now I need someone swinging at me with the Blightsteel that they brought into play with a sneak attack, and I have no way to respond to it other than hope I top deck a Path to Exile. Okay, well, I'm going to cast, this Lightning Bolt and I'm going to Arcane Denial it. I mean, I guess that wouldn't work because you don't draw until next turn, but like, there's just situations where maybe that is going to be enough to save you. At least the option exists on the spell to do that. And Max, you run Arcane Denial in some decks too. What kind of turns you around on it?
It draws me a card, and it's mainly the mana cost. That single blue in the casting cost is just efficient.
Yeah.
And you know what? If I also think it's probably, I don't tend to counter little things. I'll say it like that.
Sure.
I'm not wasting Arcane Denial on that turn 2 Soul Ring. I'm saving it for that.
You're not doing it for tempo. You're doing it to like stop the game from being lost, basically.
Exactly. I'll stop that approach. I will stop, that Blightsteel that is being casted. I'll stop that commander that has haste and I'm at 20 commander damage. Like, that's what I'm saving that for.
Makes sense. That actually goes into what you were talking about, something else in your notes there, Dana.
Yeah, and this came up a week or so ago on the MTG Goldfish cast. They're talking about Chaos Warp and rating Chaos Warp as a removal spell in red. And Chaos Warp is 1 in a red, and you shuffle a permanent into your library and reveal the top card, and it gets put into play if it's a permanent. It's not, it just stays there. And I think we've all probably been burned by a Chaos Warp before.
The worst I've ever been burned is they shuffled the card in, I cut the deck, and they flipped the same card again. I was like, oh, that sucks.
Yeah. But even then, so let's say that happens in even then, okay, if it's an attacking creature or something, they get it back, but it's no longer attacking.
No.
Like, there's even times that's enough to save you. But I guess my response is, because they were talking about how often, getting burned on Chaos Warp and stuff like that. And I don't know. I think if you're getting burned regularly by Chaos Warp, you're maybe not using Chaos Warp on the correct targets. I don't think you want to casually use Chaos Warp to remove something that's just mildly inconveniencing you. Chaos Warp is the kind of card I think you use to stop the game from being lost. When someone is swinging, again, the Blightsteel example, that's when you use Chaos Warp, because whatever they flip off of Chaos Warp is better than a Blightsteel coming at you right now. You want to use it to keep the game from being lost, not use it to just slow people up or mess with their tempo or get eke out an advantage with it. That's not when you use it. You want to use Chaos Warp to just keep the world from ending. And I think that's the thing there. It's sometimes these cards you need to look at when you use them, that offsets the downside too. The downside becomes much less important when the thing you are keeping from happening is going to basically be a loss. If, to use the Arcane Denial example again, Arcane Denial could let the person draw 10 cards, and if it stopped the spell that was going to win the game, I don't care.
Yes.
Now,
I mean, if it stops that rift.
Right, exactly. Now, don't get me wrong, I wouldn't run it if it said 10 cards, because like the window of opportunities becomes way smaller when you can use it, because you absolutely then don't want to use it unless it's 100% an end of the game situation. But I mean, the problem is maybe with some of these spells, if people are getting burned by the card draw from Denial or by the Chaos Warp, they maybe need to pick their targets a little bit better and make those decisions about when they're using those spells. And use them a little bit more, and be more picky about when they use them, so those downsides don't come up in situations where you've got something worse. Just don't use it if there's a situation where that's going to be a probability.
Yeah, honestly, like Chaos Warp, I don't think I've seen someone cast it on an opponent's thing in a long time. The last time I saw Chaos Warp cast was actually in a Reanimator deck, where he cast Chaos Warp targeting, I think it was like a sad robot or something, something weak. To shuffle it in and then flips over, like a 7-drop creature that comes into play. And I'm like, oh, okay, so that's what we're doing here. Just because they want the incremental advantage that they're going to get out of it.
I had one used against me kind of recently against a Vivictus Asmati deck.
Oh, boy.
This smells like Matt Morgan.
It was. And because I was able to, I think I dropped a dual caster mage with the Vivictus trigger on the stack to cast, or whatever card it wasn't dual caster, it was Dark Dweller. There's a goblin or a pirate that lets you cast instant or sorcery from someone's graveyard.
Okay, I think it's Dark Dweller Oracle. Or something
Is it from Ixalan, I believe? Whichever one it was. He got his Vivictus trigger, and I went to cast like a Vamp Tutor out of his graveyard to set up my top deck. And he had to Chaos Warp some meaningless piece of crap on my side to force me to shuffle.
I'm going to clear this up so the internet doesn't. It was Direfleet Daredevil.
There we go, Direfleet Daredevil. Yep.
Dark Dweller Oracle is the goblin from the not so great Eldrazi set.
Okay, gotcha.
The Gatewatch.
So yeah, so like even that kind of thing, or same thing again. Similarly, even if it's not that complicated situation, I've hit Max's deck multiple times when he's top deck tutor with like a Declamor or Unravel the Aether. Chaos Warp is the same thing. You can do the same thing when someone does a top deck tutor. It's probably worth spending 3 mana just to force a shuffle sometimes on people.
Yes,
Boo.
that's true.
Boo.
Well, that's why, we always talk about playing Deglamour and the other one, Unravel the Aether, on enchantments too. It's for that shuffle effect. I noticed a lot of people have been playing Cross and Grip a lot lately. Like, I get asked for that all the time in the store. And I've actually asked a couple of people, I'm like, why are you playing this over these more, like efficient CMC versions of this? And they said that the split second. That's the only reason that they're playing is because of split second, so no one can respond to what I'm destroying.
And that's probably, I would imagine there's some metas where like you just need to have that split second. Probably if you play a lot of combo, that makes a big difference, or things you need to get rid of to keep, whatever combo it's going to be from resolving. But I would say, again, that's a good point. If you aren't playing that combo, or if you're not playing against combo a lot, you're overpaying then. You're paying an extra mana on a Chaos War or on a Cross and Grip for utility you're not using, when you would be better off maybe with that Declamor or Unravel the Aether.
Yeah, that's because like I look at the card like Cross and Grip, and I'm just like, on the surface, I'm like, okay, so it stops, them doing anything, I guess. And to me, it just doesn't look good until, they start explaining it to me, like, well, just like they can't respond at all, so like they're going to do this and I just stop it right then and there. Yeah. And I'm like, okay, I can see that a little bit more now.
I mean, I used to run K-Grip in my green decks, mainly because we had a Gave Guru of Spores player in our local meta. and that was pretty much the only way to make sure he couldn't combo off when it goes to like, oh, I'm gonna go K-grip your Dictate Erebos or your Grave Pact, and you can't go do Gave things in response.
Sure, yeah.
Yep.
I actually, again, years ago, when I was running it in a couple decks, it was because there was a couple people that had, like, Divining Top had just gotten reprinted, and people were putting it in their decks because they were getting it cheap from, what it was, I think it was Modern Masters or something, packs where they were cracking it. And I was starting to see a bunch of tops where I hadn't been seeing them before, and K-Grip lets you remove top in a way because they can't respond by putting it on top of their library. So that was one of the reasons I was running it for a while, was I was just seeing a bunch of Divining Tops. I'm like, when I want to blow up a Divining Top, I want it gone. I don't want it to fizzle to you putting on top of your library and drawing a card. So yeah, that's kind of the opposite of a situation where, like, Sudden Spoiling is the same way. Like, there's actually a lot of kind of hidden text or utility you don't realize in that split second on Sudden Spoiling as well, and same with K-Grip, that's not obvious to a new player. So we talked about situations where Custom Grip maybe isn't useful, but yeah, understanding how split second works does reveal a whole lot of utility in those spells. That's a pretty valuable thing, being able to just lock the stack until your thing resolves. And until you see somebody do it or do goofy things with it, maybe you don't even realize how effective that is.
Agreed.
Okay, so there's definitely more cards out there like this, but like we're not going to cover all of them. The main kind of point was, if there's a card that people seem to think is powerful and you don't necessarily get why it is, you could be right. There are cards that sometimes are overrated for sure, but also it could just be that you don't, for whatever reason, quite grasp why it's good. Going back to the Gush example, I just didn't always get why Gush was good. There's a book written about Gush if you're curious why Gush is good beyond the examples I gave you. So yeah, just like if you're unsure, it's worth trying to dig a little bit deeper and trying to understand why the kind of general consensus on a card is it's very powerful, because it isn't always there in the text. And even cards that aren't, considered powerful generally, like the example I use, Experimental Synthesizer. There's a gazillion cards in Neon Dynasty that people are talking about, and that's probably not one you see very much until you actually just read it and think about it and look at it. And it probably helps if you have a deck like I do that wanted to run it. You can, like, oh, I get it now. But you have to actually think about it and spend time looking at a card. So that's really what we're kind of trying to walk away from here, is the lesson that sometimes this stuff just requires you to actually sit down and take a good look at it.
Agreed. Yeah, I know there are a lot of cards that have been coming out that people are like, this card is just amazing. And I look at it, I'm like, this is a trash card. You should just go throw this in the dumpster. And then they explain it to me and I'm like, oh, I am so wrong. And, you need to just sit down and get other people's opinions on it. So, because, someone probably sees it differently than you, which then helps you to understand that, this could work really, really well in this certain scenario.
Well, I kind of blew over Roadside Reliquary, the land from Neon Dynasty that you can spend 2 to crack it and draw a card. And if you control an artifact and an enchantment, you draw 2. Until Max talked about it on our show, and I was like, oh, that is actually really, really good. And so when I went to the pre-release, I had one in one of my pre-release packs. Yeah, right. Well, but I probably wouldn't have ran it. Because again, I was not paying attention at all. I would have seen it and like just put in a basic to have, make sure I hit my colors. But because we talked about it on the show, I'm like, oh, cool, I'm going to run this. And I think I cracked it 2 or 3 different times in my pre-release games and drew 2 every single time. And yes, that's limited, and like card draw is much more valuable there than it is in some places, or at least much tougher to come by. So it's more valuable. Blew games wide open, being able to draw 2 cards on turn 6 or something when everyone's down to like 1 or 2 cards in hand. And I just got 2 out of nowhere. Massively powerful. And I've gotten to now crack it 1 time already. I put it in a couple commander decks and I've got to use it once. Same thing, draw 2 cards out of nowhere. Feels really, really good for 2 mana. And I would have probably not really paid much attention to that had Max not mentioned on the show.
Well, You're welcome.
So there you go. I've put it in like 5 decks now. All right. That, I think, is going to wrap up episode 308 of Commander Central. We'll be back next week with a new show. I am Dana. You can find me on the Twitter birds at Dana Roach. You can find Max at CMDRCentral_Max. And you can find Chris at WiseSquishy1. Our podcast is edited by Rafael Garcia. You can find them on the Twitter birds at Ursa Bearwalker. And our podcast theme is Retro Future Dirty by Kevin MacLeod, licensed via Creative Commons. We'll be back next week with a new show. Until then, I'm Dana.
I'm Max.
And I'm Chris.